Alright, so I'm going to talk about desoldering really quick. So I have a Dell AT101W circuit board here, and this is probably not really the best PCB to demonstrate this on because in my experience these are actually exceptionally high quality PCBs with very solder pads that are very well adhered to the silicone, so they're pretty difficult to damage. I've worked with some much more cheaply made PCBs that are really easy to lift solder pads on, but here's what I do to prevent that. So actually I'll just move the camera, and if you take a look closely, hopefully you can see that, you'll notice that the pins are bent over, so this adds a little bit of a degree of difficulty as far as desoldering is concerned, and I find this a lot on Alps keyboards. Fortunately, most Cherry keyboards don't seem to do this. So what I'll do is I'll go through with the vacuum desoldering tool, and I find that I have the best results if, excuse me, I set the temperature of the soldering iron to as low a temperature as possible, to the point where it just melts the solder. Now, on these PCBs, because they seem to be extremely robustly made, I set the temperature a little higher, which enables me to work a little bit quicker. So I just, I work very quickly, and I just touch it with the soldering iron long enough to get all of the solder melted. I don't leave it on there for any longer, and then I whack it with the desoldering tool. So hopefully this kind of makes sense. So I go row by row. It'd probably be more efficient to desolder the whole keyboard at the same time, but I do one row at a time, and then I'll move on to actually moving the pins to where they need to be, just so it breaks up the monotony a little bit. So I'll get this one, and then I'll show you what I do next. Alright, so I'm about halfway done with this row. So what I'll do then is I'll take the soldering iron, and because the pins are bent, is a little hard to do without blocking the shot. Because the pins are bent, on the side where they're bent over, sometimes the solder is still stuck to the solder pad. So if you just take a screwdriver and go in and try and lift it up, sometimes you'll take the solder pad up with it, which is presumably how a lot of people encounter issues with lifting up solder pads. So I take the soldering iron and I just, gently, oh, see, I left too much solder on this one, so my fault. I just gently push until it breaks and moves just a hair. And it only takes a second or so, and you can't probably see the movement, and I'm sure you can't hear it either. And sometimes you'll find ones where there's just a little bit too much solder left, so then I just go back with the vacuum desoldering tool. But I just push until I break free with the soldering iron. And obviously, if you use the soldering iron to do this, you're heating up the solder and melting it, so there's really no chance of accidentally lifting the solder pad up with it. Ooh, jeez. Try not to let it slip. I don't put my hand here. I put my hand out of the way when I'm doing this, because obviously I don't want to get a 400 degree, 800 degree, however hot it is, soldering iron to my hand. Okay, so now that I've lifted them all up, or started to lift them all up with the soldering iron, I'll just put that back in its holder, and then I'll take a small flathead screwdriver and very carefully pry the pins up until they are upright. You don't ever want to just start yanking these out of out of their sockets unless the pins are upright. As even if they're free, they can catch on the solder pads, scratch the PCB, and potentially cause damage to the solder pad in one area. Additionally, they're a whole lot easier to remove if you move these fixing pins up, because then there's just no friction. There's nothing on which they can catch as they're coming out of the PCB. Okay. And then I'll flip it over, and I've already done some of these other rows. I leave the keycaps on, and all we need to do then is get a pair of pliers and yank upward firmly, and the switch will come right out. I don't have pliers on me right now, but that's fairly self-explanatory. But the desoldering is the most important part, and you obviously want to check and make sure all the solder is gone before you try and yank any key switches out. And the other thing I do before I start yanking the switches out is I just give it a once-over, because I can't tell you how many times I've missed desoldering one switch, and the ones I do at most are the navigation plus and enter, which are oriented differently, and so they look different to the other ones. And sometimes I've accidentally desoldered a different component on the PCB and left the solder attached to the switch. So I just try and give it a once-over, because I've broken several switches yanking on them when they were still soldered to the PCB. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know.